Horizon Just Home Switchbacks, and this is how geography is pushing China and India to war. Virtual real life lore. Yeah, this is about India video, so I'm like, yeah, okay. Uh, he reposted this video, so I guess there was something in the video where YouTube's like, oh, you can't do that. I don't look. That's very intense. I don't know how to say that. Yeah, I'm even afraid to use certain words. Let's just say how YouTube basically just sees anything that might be educational or even like historical. They just feels like, oh, wait a minute, that's a problematic. They somehow just suddenly like restricts it, right? That two layer of restriction. One restriction is like probably will like remove your monetization, not remove but limit it, which basically just means remove it. Or if it thinks that it's much stronger than that, it will like age restrict it, right? Even though there is something called like YouTube Kids and things like that, different apps and different things for kids to watch, right? But somehow like anything like their excuse is not going to be like, okay, we are not censoring this. We are just like, we don't think advertisers would agree with us here, so we can't show ads here. Basically something like that. But that's just like intensifying nowadays, right? Because 2 years ago, any real life lore video wasn't like like demonetized in a way that he has to re-upload. But nowadays I'm like noticing that a lot, right? I mean, it's not that frequent, but just like frequent enough to be frequent, right? I don't know. So I don't know what clip he used here that he had to re-upload, but there you go. I'm guessing this clip is stable because it's been like more than 24 hours and still on. So yeah, there you go. This video. So let's watch this one.
At the end of August in 2023, the People's Republic of China unveiled their new standard map, the map of China's territory from Beijing's perspective. The thing about this new standard map of China, though, is that it contains numerous territories on it that are not, in fact, actually controlled by China.
Yeah, so by geography you mean China just decided it wants more land from many different countries, including India, and that is causing tensions. I already know like border skirmishes that are happening. Border skirmish. There are videos where people like because of certain like loophole or whatever, they have to like fight with some like melee weapon and fist fight and shit like that, which is insane when you see it, right? It's always like aggression like that. I don't get it, right? China is always aggressor during this type of situation. Do you really think that you're gonna gain territory like that? Do you really think you're gonna gain territory from India? India might not be the most powerful country, but it's like in like top 5, right? You're not just gonna take territory from India in modern world without actually major war, right? So where is that thinking going?
But which China claims on the map anyway. The map shows huge territories that are currently administered by India, Bhutan, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia, the Philippines, Taiwan, Japan, and even Russia is all belonging to China, giving China the—
Even Russia, right? Imagine when they release this map or whatever, right? Imagine Putin's like, why you? It is like just the anger from him, right? Obviously, China's economy is doing much better. That Russia needs China right now. But I bet in Putin's head, like one day when I'm on top, one day I'm gonna respond or something. Because that's some bold thing, right? Just like, oh, you want this Russian area is mine. That's some next level shit.
The largest number of open territorial disputes with other countries in the world. Many of the disputes shown in the map are more well known, such as China's claims to the entirety of Taiwan and China's maritime claims projecting out across the entire South China Sea and all of the islands within it, which clashes directly with the competing maritime claims of states like Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei. Other Chinese territorial claims on the map are lesser known and less publicized, such as China's claims to the Senkaku Islands that are currently administered by Japan, while other Chinese claims on the map have appeared as brand new and are kind of open to interpretation, such as China's surprise renewal of their claim to the entire Bolshoi Ussuriski Island in Russia, though it's thought to have been settled by a treaty between Moscow and Beijing in 2008, but evidently not. But by far the biggest series of territorial disputes shown on China's new standard map, besides Taiwan and the South China Sea, are across the vast frontier separating China from India across the Himalayan mountains. The border here between the world's two most populous nations stretches and winds for 3,400 kilometers across the Earth's most—
Yeah, I mean, let's not ignore, basically I remember real life lore video, that's what he's talking about here, that it's not just about some area, it's like an entire Himalayan chain. Their goal is to eventually take over that because of like fresh water or some shit, right? That's a big land, right? So whenever you see something like that, you think like, okay, India and China war is kind of inevitable, like some kind of a, like how there's always been a war between France and like England for like a near millennia, right? How many wars are there? future kind of looks like that between India and China, right? Like, so there's going to be wars here and there constantly because of shit like this. That's just insane.
Rugged and harsh geography, through the world's highest mountains and some of its largest glaciers, and as a consequence, it has always been difficult to accurately mark on the ground where one country's territory ends and where another's begins. Consequently, the India-China border to this date has never actually been properly demarcated, and as a result, it is the longest openly disputed border remaining anywhere in the world today. With no legal recognition of what the actual border between them should look like, the de facto border between India and China is known as the line of actual control instead. The frontier between Indian-controlled territory on one side and Chinese-controlled territory on the other, where tens of thousands of soldiers on both sides stand off against each other. And on either side of the line of actual control, the rightful final borders claimed by both India and China are significantly different and vastly opposed to one another. Across 3 separate sections of the line of actual control, China and India dispute an amount of territory between them that's roughly the same size as Portugal, and home to nearly 2 million people. In the northwest are 2 larger areas known as Aksai Chin and the Trans-Karakoram Tract. Territories currently controlled and administered by China, but also claimed by India. In the center are some much smaller disputed territories, while in the east are the largest and arguably most controversial series of disputes. Here, south of the line of actual control, is the Indian-administered and controlled state of Arunachal Pradesh, an area that is roughly the same size as Austria.
Surprisingly good pronunciation. Obviously, some pronunciations were a bit higher than it should be. Arunachal Pradesh, that's how you said, but it was surprisingly close.
And home to about 1.5 million Indian citizens, that is also fully claimed in its entirety on China's new standard.
I don't know about, but first it was like, what was that, like Toyota Corolla? Now it's like Portugal, now Austria. Like, I don't know why that's funny to me, right? It's just like, he just like using these things to like actually measure. That's just awesome. You know, I think most people when they see something like that, who's not European, who's just like, okay, wait a minute, that doesn't feel clear to me. How big is Austria? How big is Portugal? Because one thing I realized, like eventually, like European countries compared to the other major countries can sometimes feel bigger and smaller. It's just like confusing sometimes.
2023 map as belonging to Beijing. China insists on referring to this territory as South Tibet instead, and they are so insistent on their claims to it that Beijing currently refuses to even stamp the Indian passports of Arunachal Pradesh residents whenever they travel to China, opting instead to provide them with stapled visas as a direct legal challenge to India's sovereignty and control over the territory. And right next door to Arunachal Pradesh or South Tibet is the independent mountain kingdom of Bhutan, a small nation home to only a little more than 700,000 people that is currently suffering a quiet and underreported on creeping invasion from China. China quietly pressed Bhutan into ceding away this northern area known as Kulakari to Beijing in the 1980s. But since then, China has quietly claimed, invaded, occupied, and even settled 3 other significant territorial claims in Bhutan in the west, the north, and the east of the country, representing roughly 12% of Bhutan's internationally recognized territory that is currently claimed by China. And China isn't just claiming these territories. In the western and northern sections of Bhutan they claim, their army has quietly occupied them and begun building military infrastructure in them. While in the northern sector, they've even begun constructing full-blown settlements and villages that have exploded in size just since 2020, with satellite images showing a rapid development of hundreds of Chinese homes and buildings in the territory over just the past 4 years.
I mean, when you have a communistic government where like people doesn't come first, it's just like your end goal of your image of country, you just tell people that you need to occupy these areas for the good of the country, and they're gonna fucking do it. Because what else they're gonna do? Go to prison or some shit? Suddenly disappear? Even the high-ranking officer in China suddenly disappears for whatever reason and reappears a few years later, and their views are completely changed now. Isn't that something? This is insane, man. It's literally bullying Bhutan into like taking that much land. Yeah, this is, I don't know, man. The aggressiveness is just like going up and up, right? I mean, 10 years ago, I mean, China was still aggressive, but not at this level, right? The more stronger they get, the more aggressive they are becoming. See, the thing is, Indian election is undergoing right now, and if the Modi is still like re-elected, right? I don't know if he's gonna, I mean, it looks like he's probably gonna get re-elected. Modi is one of those people who just doesn't just sit on their asses. Doesn't matter what your view is on him, right? Whether you think positively of him or negatively. The point is, he's aggressive, right? He certain things that he, you know, like volatile, right? Like any politician plays safe. just so the politician doesn't get bad image. That's not Modi. He doesn't care, right? If he thinks certain goal is right, if he thinks this goal is right, he's gonna do it, even if there's a chance people might be angry. He just stopped 1,000 rupee note, right? He just suddenly stopped nationwide for 1.4 billion people. And everybody had to like turn over their money. This was one of the things that any politician sees. They're like, what the fuck? We can't do that, right? We are not going to get re-elected. Modi didn't care. So if Modi gets re-elected, right, China's aggression will be met with even stronger response, right? India's not just going to say, okay, let's just take it slow. Let's just see. India's not going to do that if Modi is still in place, which is good thing, I think, right? If someone is aggressive like that, you need to have aggressive answer to that, just to show them like we are not some weak. So if Modi is elected, right, the future aggression is going to met with some kind of similar response.
China is therefore constructing entire villages within Bhutan's internationally recognized territory, changing the demographic facts on the ground and reinforcing their claims with settlers and soldiers, while they're continuing to add on new territorial claims as well. It was only in 2020 when China suddenly also began claiming the Sakteng Wildlife Sanctuary in the far east of Bhutan as well, a territory that they don't yet control on the ground like the other two, but which they might also attempt to quietly invade and seize soon as well in the future. These numerous territorial disputes between India and China are extremely controversial. In 1962, they led to a war between them that killed thousands. And since the 2010s, they've nearly led to the outbreak of another war between them on multiple occasions, as the geopolitical rivalry between Beijing and New Delhi has intensified, including extremely tense military standoffs across the line of actual control in 2017 and again in 2020 that left dozens of soldiers killed and wounded and involved brutal hand-to-hand medieval-style combat between the two rival armies. And in order to understand why India and China have all of these territorial disputes today that add up to an area the same size as Portugal, why the intensity of the dispute has been growing increasingly higher in the 2020s, why China has quietly invaded, occupied, and even colonized around 12% of Bhutan's territory, and how this entire situation could push the world's two biggest countries, with more than 1/3 of the global human population between them, each armed with nuclear weapons, into a cataclysmic confrontation in the future. It helps to understand the historical and geographic origins of the dispute, and what's truly at stake from both China and India's perspectives. The modern states of India and the People's Republic of China were born around the same historical era. Modern India was born after it received its independence from the British following the conclusion of the Second World War in 1947, while the People's Republic of China was established only 2 years later in 1949 after the Communists finally emerged victorious in the long-running Chinese Civil War against the Chinese nationalists. And upon each of their geopolitical appearances, they each inherited the outstanding baggage and decisions of their legal predecessors, the colonial British authorities in India's case, and the Qing Empire and the independent state of Tibet in China's case. The area of Aksai Chin in the western sector almost immediately became controversial over differing interpretations between Beijing and New Delhi over border treaties signed between both of their predecessors. The region itself has almost always been a remote, difficult to access, and largely unpopulated high-altitude desert that historically didn't matter very much. In the 19th century, it was understood between the colonial authorities and British and in the 19th century.
Does that say bro at your service? What is that? Somebody wrote that?
It was understood between the colonial authorities in British India and the Qing Empire that the border between their realms ran somewhere through this area. But because of the region's difficult-to-access geography, the exact boundary remained largely undefined. Eventually, in 1897, the British authorities in India proposed the Johnson-Ardugh Line to be the boundary between them along the crest of the Kunlun Mountains, which placed Aksai Chin fully within the territory of the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, which was effectively a British protectorate at the time. This line was, however, seemingly never actually presented to the Chinese government for approval. And then, just 2 years later, in 1899, British authorities in India proposed and presented.
I mean, why would they give it to Chinese government? I mean, there you go. British said it, so that's the case. The end. Why would you ask China? Why would you even converse with China? Right there you go. Classic, British thing.
A completely different boundary line here to the Qing Chinese, called the McCartney-MacDonald Line, which placed the boundary further to the southwest along the crest of the Karakoram mountain range instead, and effectively put Aksai Chin within China instead. The British authorities presented the McCartney-MacDonald Line to the Qing government in 1899 through a note, but the Qing never actually officially acknowledged or responded to it, which has led to more than a century of differing interpretations ever since. The Indian government has insisted that the Qing's lack of a response to the McCartney-MacDonald Line indicated their rejection of it, while the modern Chinese government has insisted that the lack of a response only indicated that the Qing already believed it to be the accepted boundary and that a response wasn't necessary. Confusingly, official British maps from 1899 up until India's independence in 1947 use both the Johnson-Ardagh Line and the McCartney-MacDonald Line almost interchangeably, while no attempts were made by either the British or the Chinese to actually establish any authority between the lines on the ground. So when India achieved its independence in 1947, it claimed the entirety of the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir as its own territory, and they selected the Johnson-Ardagh Line as their official eastern border that placed Aksai Chin within their territory. Well, naturally, after the communists took over control of China after 1949, they selected the McCartney-MacDonald Line as the official boundary that placed Aksai Chin as an extension of their own Xinjiang province. But despite this disputed boundary, relations between China and India were initially relatively warm. India became the very first non-communist country to recognize the People's Republic of China's government in April of 1950. But merely months after they did that, in October of 1950, China tested the relationship when they invaded and then annexed the de facto independent state of Tibet. After the Qing Empire had collapsed in 1912, Tibet managed to emerge out of the chaos as a de facto independent Buddhist theocracy that survived for decades. Although the Republic of China that initially succeeded the Qing never recognized Tibet's independence, and Tibet remained a largely unrecognized state by the rest of the outside international community for its entire existence, except by Mongolia, who had similarly declared their independence following the Qing's collapse. During the roughly 4 decades of the early 20th century that Tibet remained de facto independent, it unilaterally entered into a series of border negotiations with the colonial British authorities in neighboring India. Between 1913 and 1914, Tibetan authorities met with representatives of Britain and the Republic of China at the Simla Convention to discuss the status of Tibet and Tibet's borders with British India. The British proposed that Tibet would remain under the control of the Tibetan government as effectively an autonomous Chinese tributary or vassal state, while the British further proposed that the previously undefined border between British India and Tibet would follow a line drawn up by then British India Foreign Secretary Henry McMahon that became known as the McMahon Line. The McMahon Line placed a vast area that had previously been under Tibetan and Qing influence within British India. And incensed, the Chinese negotiators present at the Simla Convention refused to sign the agreement and left, which left the British and Tibetan representatives to sign the final agreement anyway without Chinese approval that solidified the McMahon Line as the border from each of their perspectives. The nature in which this agreement was signed without Chinese approval has remained controversial for more than a century ever since. By signing the agreement and effectively annexing the territory south of the McMahon Line, the British violated numerous previous treaties they had signed, such as the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907 that bound Britain into not negotiating with Tibet except through the intermediary of the Chinese government, and the Anglo-Chinese Convention of 1906, which further bound Britain to not annex any Tibetan territory. Since there were significant legal doubts to the McMahon Line's validity even during the time period, the British never even showed the McMahon Line on any of their maps of India until 23 years later after it was signed in 1937. While the British never even published that the Simla Convention had even happened at all in their treaty record, all the way until 1938. China has therefore argued ever since, as both the Republic of
Oh my god, such a chaotic shit, and of course British are the center of it. I mean, it's India's involved, so of course British is going to be involved. But that is insane, right? When you think you can have two takes from this, right? You can say like it was like messy, China wasn't responding, so I guess this kind of confusion was inevitable. But you would also think like if you try to take it more seriously, you would have taken steps better, right? You would have tried to involve China, just like, try to involve China better, right? Trying to get answer from them rather than just ignoring them completely. Like, back then, China wasn't strong as they are today, so I guess British is like, they don't want to answer, I don't care. And just moved on and created this mess, I guess. But there you go.
China and later as the People's Republic of China, that the Tibetan government never had the legal authority to unilaterally agree with the British on the borders of Tibet, because, they argue, that China never recognized Tibet's independence. China has thus maintained that the 1914 Simla Convention, that assigned the territory south of the McMahon Line to British India, was an unequal treaty forced upon them during the century of humiliation, and that India's continued control of what they refer to as South Tibet is a lasting legacy of British imperialism. While, conversely, as the legal successor to British India, India recognizes the legitimacy of the McMahon Line and argues that it follows the natural geographic border of the Indian subcontinent across the crest of the Himalayan mountains, and that China's claims to what they call Arunachal Pradesh south of the Himalayas is a legacy of Chinese imperialism to a territory that has been Indian for nearly a century now. Either way, after China invaded Tibet in 1950 and annexed it in 1951, they immediately inherited the territorial dispute south of the McMahon Line controlled by India, in addition to the disputes over Aksai Chin between the Johnson-Ardagh and McCartney-MacDonald lines, as well as several other smaller disputes in between. And the whole reason why the Chinese Communist Party decided to invade and annex Tibet in the first place was rooted in paranoia over the risk of India gaining influence or control over Tibet instead. You see, Tibet is often referred to as the water tower of Asia, or as the world's third pole, because it contains the highest and largest reserve of fresh water that can be found anywhere in the world outside of the polar regions.
Okay, look, I wanna say like China being paranoid this and that, but I understand, right? If I were China, I mean, my response would be similar. I mean, you don't take chances like that when your like water supply is literally on stake, right? And you're gonna be paranoid like that. Like, what if India basically claims all the shit? Basically, after independence with the British line this, British did this and all that. Just like how usually maps are drawn, right? Like claims and confusions are gonna rise. So I guess China just feared that, like, what if Tibet also, like, in India recognized Tibet is India's or something, right? Even though like since the Indian Republic is formed, right, 1950. Independence was 1947, government was founded in 1950. Since then, India hasn't done like aggressive takeover type of thing, right? India has never have that kind of thing. It just like claimed based on like whatever historical reason that this area belongs to India, and when the actual maps were drawn, right? There is always some kind of a legitimacy behind those claims. Not that just Tibet is mine, this is mine. India doesn't do that shit.
The Tibetan Plateau has tens of thousands of glaciers scattered all across it, and it contains the headwaters that give rise to many of Asia's mightiest rivers, including both the Yellow and Yangtze rivers that flow through China, the Mekong River that flows through Southeast Asia, the Indus River that flows through Pakistan, and the Brahmaputra River that eventually flows through Northeast India and Bangladesh. The waters that originate in the Tibetan Plateau are estimated to provide the lion's share of freshwater supplies to approximately 2 billion people across Asia, while the Yangtze and Yellow rivers through China provide the primary drinking water supply for about 600 million Chinese citizens. Not to mention all of the electricity they provide through modern mega projects like the Three Gorges Dam on the Yangtze River, which all on its own produces roughly the same amount of electricity as the entire country of Bangladesh does, with nearly 170 million people. The security of the water supplies in these two rivers is a core strategic concern of China's. And so, immediately after the People's Republic was proclaimed in 1949, the Chinese Communist Party opted to permanently secure the river sources by securing their control over Tibet, so that a hypothetical regional rival in the future, like India, would never be able to do that instead. Initially, the Chinese granted Tibet significant autonomy after they seized control over it, and in 1952, the Indian government chose to even recognize China's newly established sovereignty over Tibet, hoping to allay China's senses of insecurity in the region. But then only a few years later, by 1959, significant tensions had built up between the Tibetans, who had been used to an absolute Tibetan Buddhist theocracy that revered the Dalai Lama, and the new communist Chinese authorities that espoused the eradication of feudalism and the destruction of religion. Religious Tibetans began worrying that the Chinese authorities were preparing to arrest the 14th Dalai Lama, and the tensions eventually exploded into a full-blown Tibetan revolt against Chinese authority in 1959. The People's Liberation Army cracked down on the revolt harshly, killing thousands of Tibetans in the process and sending the 14th Dalai Lama and some of his loyal entourage to flee across the border for safety in India, where he, along with thousands of Tibetan refugees, were all granted asylum. Afterwards, the 14th Dalai Lama established the Tibetan government in exile in India right across the border, and he continues to survive there in India to this very day in 2024 at the age of 88. Much to the unease of China. China miscalculated at the time in 1959 that India had fomented the rebellion in Tibet, and that New Delhi ultimately intended to transform Tibet into a protectorate of theirs, which would have established Indian control over the sources of the Yangtze and Yellow rivers. And India's subsequent welcoming and hosting of the Dalai Lama and his government in exile only fueled China's paranoia about this even further. In the aftermath, China clamped down on Tibet more harshly and revoked the province's formerly high levels of autonomy.
Yeah, I mean, India gave, basically a place for Dalai Lama because India is India, democracy, right? Free is the whole word around it, right? That's why. So obviously China's gonna see that they give a place for Dalai Lama because they were like already like talking and trying to take over Tibet or whatever. Like that's the evidence. Not really, right? You're doing heinous shit. You're killing people left and right, right? In just like communism, basically. Good, there's not much explanation for the communism, right? I mean, there's many instances in Chinese history where there's just like massacres after massacres because it didn't fit what China CCP was trying to do or something, right? So India obviously doesn't like all that shit. Democracy, that's the point. So obviously they give like place to Dalai Lama.
While Chinese control of Tibet established Beijing's comparatively more easy access to the disputed territory of Aksai Chin relative to India, since Aksai Chin was located on the opposite side of the Karakoram Mountains from India and accessible to the rest of the flatter Tibetan plateau from China. This then led the Chinese across the 1950s to construct a strategic highway across Aksai Chin that connected their provinces of Tibet and Xinjiang, which transformed Aksai Chin into a strategically valuable territory for China as an infrastructure linkage point between two of the country's most politically unstable regions. And that led the Chinese authorities to present a deal to India the year after the Tibetan Revolt in 1960, on settling the border dispute between them. China proposed creating a demilitarized zone between them across the length of the border, and offered to recognize India's control over Arunachal Pradesh south of the McMahon Line, in exchange for India recognizing China's control over the newly strategically valuable Aksai Chin, with an updated border region several miles west of the old McCartney-McDonald Line, in order to give China a large buffer away from their strategically valuable highway. India, however, categorically refused the Chinese offer on all counts, insisted that both Arunachal Pradesh and Aksai Chin were Indian territories, and began moving troops to advance towards India's claimed borders. If India advanced all the way towards their claimed boundary in Aksai Chin towards the old Johnson-Ardagh line, then the Indians would have severed the highway connecting Tibet and Xinjiang, and they would control a geographic launch pad on the other side of the Karakoram Mountains within the Tibetan Plateau itself, that they could use to project power into the rest of Tibet from. And calculating that that was unacceptable, the Chinese decided to respond by launching a war against India in 1962. Thousands of soldiers died in the ensuing Sino-Indian War, and by the end of it, the Chinese had emerged decisively victorious, pushing their de facto line of control all the way to their desired western frontier in Aksai Chin to the foothills of the Karakoram Mountains, and even advancing deeper south of the McMahon Line in the east into Arunachal Pradesh, though they decided to withdraw back north across the McMahon Line afterwards, so as not to antagonize outside powers too greatly like the United States. The defeat in the 1962 war served as a national shock and humiliation to India, while it provided a lesson at China that deterring India's territorial ambitions in the region required occasional displays of violence to put down. For decades afterward, the border dispute between India and China remained present but at a lower level of intensity, as China dealt with numerous internal crises and economic problems that disincentivized external shows of strength. Beijing pursued territorial compromises and settlements with many of their other neighbors during this time period, like with Myanmar and Nepal during the 1959 Tibetan Uprising, with Mongolia, Vietnam, and Laos in the aftermath of the Great Chinese Famine in the 1960s, and after the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre, and with Central Asian states like Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Afghanistan during high periods of unrest in Xinjiang across the 1960s and the 1990s. But then, beginning in the early 1990s, China's economic fortunes and geopolitical power began rapidly shifting as the era of China's incredible economic rise began. China's economy soared into becoming the second largest in the world in nominal terms by 2010. And it even became the largest in the world by purchasing power parity terms by 2016, when it surpassed the United States. China's economic rise was so rapid between 1970 and 2022 that it went from accounting for less than 3% of the global economy in 1970 to accounting for nearly a fifth of the global economy by 2022. And with China's increasing economic power came its rapidly increasing military power as well. And with that, China's growing ambitions. China became less and less interested in settling and compromising with its remaining open territorial disputes it had with Taiwan and the South China Sea, and with India and Bhutan across the line of actual control. And after the rise of Xi Jinping to power in China since 2012,
look, if you're China, right? You are in very good geological position, right? You have a lot of minerals and things that you need for very complicated like electronics, chipset, weapons, even nukes. You have certain things that no one on the planet has, rare earth elements basically. China has a lot of rare earth elements that nobody else has, right? A lot of things depend on China. On top of that, your economy grew that fast. You become like insanely powerful, right? Everything depends on China type of a economy and everything, right? And on top of that, you got like communistic mentality, CCP. If you put all those three together, you realize like China's aggression, where it's coming from, right? If you're that powerful, if you're that important, and if your mentality is like just iron fist, right? You don't even negotiate with your own people, right? You massacre your own people if they don't fit certain ideology, right? So at that point, you can kind of see like where their aggression is coming from.
the People's Republic has pursued a much more aggressive and assertive foreign policy with its neighbors, a trend that has been similarly followed in India since the 2014 election of Narendra Modi, who also pursues an assertive and nationalist foreign policy for India as well. From the current perspective of New Delhi in 2024, they have many reasons to be wary of China's position and intentions on the other side of the line of actual control, especially in the eastern region around Bhutan and Arunachal Pradesh. China's internationally recognized control of the Chumbi Valley region wedged in between India's Sikkim state and Bhutan is sometimes referred to in Indian strategic circles as a Chinese dagger that points precipitously close to one of India's greatest geographic vulnerabilities, the narrow Siliguri corridor. Sometimes also referred to as the Chicken's Neck, this is the extremely narrow land bridge that's only 24 kilometers wide, wedged in between the independent states of Nepal and Bangladesh, that serves as
See, that's the thing, that is the most intense thing that is when it comes to India and China, this right here, right? Entire video is gonna have a lot of points, but this point is the most important one when it comes to India and China war. Because say if China decides to do what Russia did with Ukraine, where they are gonna attack? They're going to attack probably there, so they can cut off entire east of India. You literally cut off the entire access to east part of the India if you just take over that place. And you can then systematically try to take over the entire eastern part of India, and you might be successful if you do that well, right? So India has to have like insane amount of security there, which they do. Way too many soldiers and like infrastructure is around that place, right? So China can't basically take that place. That's how it is right now. Right, with the current government is focusing there in that type of tactical way, but that is the most important point, right? Cut off a major part of India.
The only land connection India has between their primary territory and their 7 northeastern states. If the 24-kilometer-wide Siliguri corridor were to come under Chinese occupation in the event of another war, then China would cut off the roughly 50 million Indians who live here in the northeast from any available access to the rest of India. While perhaps even more pressingly, China would also sever India's ability to send any reinforcements by land through their own territory to support Arunachal Pradesh, which would enable the PLA to advance China's territorial claim in the region south of the McMahon Line, with heavily restricted Indian reinforcements and logistics. This paranoia from India's perspective is not helped by the location of China's territorial claims and incursions into Bhutan either, and specifically this Chinese claim in Bhutan immediately to the east of the Chumbi Valley, known as the Doklam Plateau. Were China to gain a firm control over the Doklam Plateau here, they would acquire the strategic eastern high ground looking down into their own Chumbi Valley that would reinforce their control over the valley, enable them to more effectively mobilize and concentrate troops in the area, and grant them more access routes into India in the event of a conflict, while they would also extend their territorial control much further south to the southern foothills of the Himalayan mountains, which would then enable the PLA to easily observe the Siliguri corridor only 87 kilometers away and observe any potential Indian troop movements flowing through the corridor. India has maintained a very close special relationship with Bhutan ever since they signed a treaty of friendship all the way back in 1949, which granted India special guidance over Bhutan's foreign and defense policy, especially as it related to China. That treaty was only slightly relaxed as recently as 2007, and India has continued to remain as essentially Bhutan's most important ally and protector, as New Delhi wants to maintain Bhutan's territorial integrity as much as possible to keep them as a buffer state separating their vulnerable Siliguri corridor away from China. Meanwhile, over in the western sector, India remains wary of China's.
Yeah, I mean, obviously when it comes to Bhutan, right, like there's not gonna be much friction there when it comes to like being allied with India, because Bhutan is feeding China, so obviously being allied with India would be the right answer. Same thing with India. India needs Bhutan, right? If Bhutan basically like becomes ally of China, or becomes something like, like if some another power comes in Bhutan who's basically pro-China, that would be massive issue for India. Same thing that happens in Maldives, right? Maldives was like same way Bhutan was like ally of India, because like touching India literally in the south of India, right, in Indian Ocean. But now the new one who's elected is like pro-China now. Asked all the Indian troops to get out and everything, which caused a lot of economical issue, because entire Maldives economy was based on like tourism, Indian tourism, which they basically stopped going there. But yeah, it was mostly China forced thing, right? Whatever incentives were given, whatever. So basically China is plotting a lot of things. We already know like how China's like trying to dominate Indian Ocean. This is one of the things, trying to dominate India that way. If you have some like pro-China island literally touching India in south of India, not to mention in the north is literally China there, you're trying to like like trap India and try to panic India that way, trying to build ports in Sri Lanka already. So this is like I don't know, like a thought out long-term plan of China, trying to like either force India or trying to attack India. Who the fuck knows? But there you go. Alright, I'll do the second reactions later, I guess, in part 2. This was how geography is pushing China and India to war. When the more accurate title is like when geography became a thing, China just decided to become aggressor or some shit like that. But there you go. Not that China doesn't have like real claims or shit like that. Everybody has real claims, because the borders were drawn up during the British time, right? But whatever shit happened then it became like normal thing 100 years after. Now China suddenly, no, wait a minute, Arunachal Pradesh is ours. Like, that's not how it works. But there you go. Alright, I'll see you next time.